Hello, U.S. history. This is part two of our World War II lecture on the actual war. We left off on part one talking about D-Day. All right. So now we're going to continue on. And basically, what we see is the D-Day invasion. While we had a lot of casualties, a lot of losses, it was successful. All right. We are successfully able to break through those German lines and then start slowly making our way through France and then, of course, into Germany. About 2 months after the D-Day invasion, Paris was liberated from German occupation. General Patton was the one who's going to lead this fight across France and then into Germany. In December of 1944, we see the really key Battle of the Bulge. All right. This was the Germans kind of throwing up all of their last defenses, an attempt to stop the Allied advance, stop them from getting into Germany, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. And what we see is basically by spring, early 1945, this is when the Allied troops start to get into Germany. And that's the Soviets are coming in from the other way, all right? And that's the idea, to start coming into Germany and taking Berlin ultimately, right? So you can see here, remember the fall of France in June of 1940 was that huge pivotal moment in the war, showing everyone how powerful the Germans were. And then 4 years later, right, the Americans are there to liberate Paris. All right. We start making our way across France, and then the idea is to get to Germany. You can see the map here. This is the Battle of the Bulge. This is how it's got its name. The Germans were able to create this bulge here in the Allies' line, but the Americans, especially the 101st Division right here, were able to hold at Bastogne in the winter here of 1944. It was really cold, terrible conditions, but the Americans were able to hold, stop that German advance, and then continue to make our way through Germany, right? So the Allies are coming in this way, the Soviets coming in from the east, right? And it's really coming to the end for the Germans here. And it's right around this time period that we start to discover those concentration camps. The top leadership, like FDR and top military leadership, they knew what was going on with the Holocaust, but most people didn't. Everyday people, the soldiers, didn't know what was going on until they literally started coming across these camps, and we could really see the full extent of what the Germans were doing with the Holocaust. Also around this time period, 1944, is an election year. FDR is going to run and win here for his fourth and final term. And he's going to pick a new vice president, this guy, Harry Truman, as his running mate here in the 1944 election. He was relatively unknown, didn't have a lot of experience, but obviously he's going to have some big shoes to fill, right? Because FDR only serves a little bit of his fourth term there. As you can see from this photo, one of the last photos of him taken, he is looking pretty old, pretty sickly. And like I said, he is only going to live a few more months. So what we see here, before FDR does die, he is able to meet one more time with Churchill and Stalin to discuss the end of the war, to call for the Germans to surrender. It was also decided that the Soviets would be the one to take Berlin, which is kind of a fateful choice. This is going to set up the next phase of history, which of course is the Cold War. So the Soviets win the Battle of Berlin here, April of 1945, officially forcing the Germans, the Nazis, to surrender. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. The Germans at first said they were going to continue, but just about a week later, they're going to formally surrender to the Allies here, May 7th, 1945. The next day celebrated as VE Day. or victory in Europe. So you can see here the Soviet victory at the Battle of Berlin, holding the Soviet flag. Again, this is great because the war is coming to an end, but like I said, is setting up the next conflict, which is going to be the Cold War. So keep that in mind. Like I said, Hitler committed suicide during this, and then FDR also died, which was a huge shock to the nation. The country was very saddened. There was lots of mourning. FDR had been this great president who had led us through so much, the Great Depression, the war. For some people, he was the only president that Americans knew, and now he was gone. And, Harry Truman, like I said, didn't have a lot of experience, was not really well known, but he's going to have some big shoes to fill. All right. So you can see here some of the VE Day celebrations, victory in Europe. Of course, Europe has been at war for like 6 years now. Very excited that the war is over. However, right, if you kind of check out this headline, that last line there is revealing that we still have the war in the Pacific, right? We still have the war with Japan to figure out. So if we turn our attention back to the war in the Pacific, right? That island hopping campaign is ongoing. We get closer and closer and closer to mainland Japan, but the fighting is quite fierce. Casualties are very, very high. In March of 1945, we see three significant victories. First of all, we're able to retake the Philippines, which is great after having to surrender them 3 years prior. We see a victory here at the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is really key. As you can see here, very close to mainland Japan. And then we see the firebombing of Tokyo. As we got closer to mainland Japan, we could launch, attacks on those main islands there, which would be really key for victory. And then in June of 1945, the U.S. won the Battle of Okinawa. Again, quite close to mainland Japan. You can see Iwo Jima and Okinawa, key significant victories there. Okinawa is the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, so it's the most deadly, the most casualties, most injuries, most deaths in all of the Pacific war battles. And this is pretty much the end for the Japanese. After this, we called for the Japanese to surrender unconditionally, and we started to plan for the invasion of mainland Japan, similar to like a D-Day style invasion like we did with France. That was the idea here, all right? So you can see this photograph. You may recognize it from one of my posters in the classroom, right? This is the Marine Corps, the Marines raising this flag here on Mount Suribachi, signifying victory in the Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the most iconic photos from World War II and pretty much all of U.S. history. That image was used here to create this monument, the Marine Corps War Memorial. It's this huge, huge statue right outside of Arlington National Cemetery. And that brings us to the Manhattan Project. So this is the top secret government project that developed the atomic weapons, all right? It was led by the U.S., but we do receive help from the Canadians and the British. So we have lots of scientists and military officials working with this. We actually started this because this guy, Albert Einstein, actually reached out to President Roosevelt. He sent a letter to President Roosevelt saying that it was thought that the Germans were actually developing atomic weapons. And so that's why we started our project, thinking that we might have to use it against Germany. This guy, Robert Oppenheimer, became the head of the Manhattan Project. So he was the key lead scientist on the project. It took many, many years. They worked in many, many different sites, as you can see all over. They had all these different labs and testing sites right here. This is the kind of key one here in New Mexico, the Los Alamos Laboratory, and then Alamogordo was the key testing site where they successfully tested the first bomb in July of 1945. And then the next step is we have to decide whether to use it against the Japanese, right? The war is still ongoing. The Japanese are refusing to surrender. We had other options. We could do that invasion, right? Like a D-Day style invasion. We could do a big naval blockade. we could do some sort of demonstration of the bomb, you know, perhaps off the coast of Japan to show the Japanese, you know, how powerful this weapon was, right? But ultimately, it was decided, of course, that we were going to use the bomb on August 6th, 1945. The first one, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima. It killed about 150,000 people. It's estimated that about half died instantly and about half died in kind of the days or weeks afterwards from radiation poisoning and injuries. The Japanese refused to surrender. After that, on August 8th, the Soviets declared war on Japan. Still no surrender. So on August 9th, the next atomic bomb, nicknamed Batman, was dropped on Nagasaki, which killed about 75,000 people. Finally, the Japanese decided to surrender on August 15th, which was still the 14th here because of the time difference, so either day is fine. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced that the Japanese would surrender. He actually went on the radio and addressed the Japanese people, which was kind of unheard of. And he announced that the Japanese would finally surrender on September 2nd. As you can see here from this photograph, we see the official surrender of the Japanese to General Douglas MacArthur right here. We see that formal surrender to General MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri. So either day is fine for VJ Day. Some people say September 2nd, some say the 14th or 15th. It's not as clear cut as VE Day. All right. So the results here, the war cost about $330 billion. It was paid for mostly through expanding income tax, selling war bonds, but mostly through deficit spending. We do see a big increase in our national debt as a result, but nothing compared to today, of course. In terms of casualties, there's about 1 million US casualties, meaning injuries and deaths. Of those, 416,000 Americans died in World War II. Worldwide, it's estimated that there's about 20 to 25 million military deaths and about 50 to 55 million civilian deaths total. So you can kind of see the graphic here. World War II is the deadliest thing that has ever happened in the world, right? You can see here the Soviets have, you know, millions and millions of military and civilian deaths. The Chinese, of course, are next. Poland has a lot. Germany, Japan. You can just see the huge scale of the death and destruction in this war. Right here is the World War II War Memorial. This is in Washington, D.C. It's one of our biggest memorials. It's this huge thing. It has this big fountain. And on the back wall right there, you can see this, where it has all those gold stars. It says, "Here we mark the price of freedom," and all of them represent the 416,000 Americans that gave their lives in World War II, because that was what traditionally families would put in their window if they had a family member that died, would be that gold star. So hugely costly money, human lives, of course, but in the end, we were victorious, and then we are going to go on to the next phase of world history and U.S. history. All right. So we're going to end this lecture here, and then we'll pick up later. We'll talk about post-war United States, what it's like at home, foreign policy, Cold War, all that jazz. I hope you have a great day. Bye.